Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I will start with some logistics for the people who will be listening in Spanish. Para las personas que deseen escuchar este webinar en español, usted puede seleccionar el lenguaje en el icono que parece un pequeño mundo en la parte de abajo de su pantalla. Sus opciones son inglés o español. Para escuchar el audio en español, tendrá que seleccionarlo y silenciar el idioma original haciendo un clic en donde dice Mute Original Audio. During the duration of this webinar, all attendees will be muted. You will need to ask questions through the Q&A chat on your screens, and our panelists will see your questions and respond. If you have a question for a specific panelist, please include their name. So again, good morning or afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this MCC webinar on border realities, which is the second part of a 6-part series. We had a very positive experience the first round and are excited to continue with you all. My name is Catherine Smith, and I work for Mennonite Central Committee as the Border and Migration Outreach Coordinator for the West Coast region. This webinar series has been put together by the MCC US Immigration Network. The purpose of this informational webinar is to continue to stay in touch with what is happening across the country and outside the US related to migration and displaced people. Communities and populations which were already vulnerable before the pandemic outbreak have become exceedingly vulnerable and in high danger due to COVID-19. And media coverage has focused on contagion and death rates while setting aside immigration and border news. So in this webinar, we will talk with MCC staff and partners and friends from around the country who will report from their fields and provide current information on what is happening. We want to know how individuals, groups, organizations, and faith communities are responding, how policies and protocols are affecting these populations, and how each of us can get involved and support their work during this time. So it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists for this webinar. Our first panelist will be Joanna Williams. She is the Director of Education and Advocacy at Keno Border Initiative in Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora, where she has been since 2015. She graduated with a bachelor's in science from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and received a master's in public policy from Arizona State University. Prior to her current position, she has journeyed with immigrants in a variety of contexts. She volunteered at a shelter in Tierra Blanca, Veracruz, conducted Fulbright research on the reintegration of deported and returned migrants, and worked as a coordinator for the American Civil Liberties Union's Border Litigation Project. Welcome, Joanna. Our second panelist will be Joyce Hamilton, who is the co-founder and grassroots organizer at Angry Tias and Abuelas. Originally from San Antonio, currently living in Harlingen, Texas, Joyce holds a master's degree in education from UT Austin, Texas. Joyce is retired from a career in educational program administration and in college teaching. Prior to retirement, she moved to South Texas 18 years ago to teach at the college in the Rio Grande Valley. Joyce helped establish the grassroots group, Angry Tias and Abuelas, or Angry Aunts and Grandmas, of the Rio Grande Valley in early June of 2018. And for the past 2 years, she has primarily been dedicated to the work of Angry Tias and Abuelas, which is now composed of 8 women, beating every immigration challenge and barrier erected by the current administration. She is an elder at Treasure Hills Presbyterian Church in Harlingen. Welcome, Joyce. And our third and fourth panelists will be Jack and Linda Knox, who are border residents, volunteers, activists, and hosts of Shalom House. Jack and Linda Knox retired to Douglas, Arizona, which is on the US-Mexico border in 2012. They previously lived in Salem, Oregon, where Jack was a pastor of Salem Mennonite Church, and Linda was a math teacher at Western Mennonite School. For the past 8 years, they have volunteered at the Migrant Resource Center, taught English classes, worked with children at an educational enrichment center, supported women at a co-op that teaches skills to encourage self-sufficiency, and most recently accompanied asylum seekers to the U.S. port of entry in Agua Prieta, Sonora. In Douglas, they opened a hospitality house for people who need a place to stay, and they have welcomed members of the Douglas community visiting groups coming to learn about immigration issues, volunteers working on both sides of the border, graduate students, researchers, writers, and even a border patrol agent. So welcome, Jack and Linda. So we will get right into it. We'll have 3 different presentations, starting with Joanna Williams. So we'll give her a second to share her screen and then hear from her.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your attention and just participating in this webinar. Sometimes we can feel very far away here at the border, and it's great to have your participation. I want to talk, I'm going to dive into what the current reality is with recent policy changes and the realities of COVID-19. But I actually want to give a small background on just the last, a 1-minute version of the last couple of years, which has been this struggle for life at the border that we've accompanied from the Keno Border Initiative. So we at the Keno Border Initiative, we're a binational organization that provides direct services to migrants in Nogales, Mexico. And what we've been in the front line of witnessing over the last several years has been the administration's systematic effort to dismantle access to asylum at the border. So make it so that people who are fleeing violence don't have any way to seek protection in the United States. And they've done this through a variety of ways, one of which is a policy called metering, where people who are arriving to present at a port of entry, at a designated port of entry and ask for asylum, are told, well, we don't have space for you, there's no capacity, you're just gonna have to wait. There's another policy called Remain in Mexico, also known as MPP, where people who do seek asylum, they've already been detained by US authorities, then they're sent back to Mexico to wait for their court dates many months or years later that they then can finish arguing their asylum case. There's a variety of other policies that have affected people here, including the asylum ban and other kinds of rapid deportations. And this isn't a policy webinar necessarily, so I won't dive into all of those details. But I think it's really important to understand that this has been happening over the course of several years, this buildup of different policies affecting families here in Nogales, Mexico. And yet, families have still arrived here from Mexico, from Central America, trying to seek safety for their kids, trying to struggle for their lives and especially the lives of their children and their families as a whole. So just to give you a snapshot of the impact of these policies, there we go. Just to give you a snapshot of the impact of these policies in the right before the border closure and right before the beginning of COVID-19 in the region. You can see these are just a couple of charts of the number of people who are in Nogales, Mexico, who are stranded under one or the other policy. So either metering, which you can see is affecting primarily Mexicans, or Remain in Mexico, which is a different profile of nationalities. But all told, I won't make you add up all of the numbers, but all told we had over 1,000 asylum seekers stranded in Nogales, Mexico, even before the border was closed and other measures were put into place. And the families who are waiting under metering, which again is when people are just waiting for the very beginning of their asylum case, those families had been waiting in Nogales, Mexico for approximately 4 months by the end of February of 2020. So they're already in this very prolonged sense of limbo where every day they would come to our aid center carrying all their belongings and with their kids, as you can see in this photo, and every day then go to a shelter on the other side of town or a place where they were renting. So there was already this prolonged limbo and people were trying to navigate that space. when then the policy changed in mid-March of 2020, which is where I want to dive in and spend a little bit more time. So on March 20th, the Trump administration announced that the border would be closed to so-called non-essential travel. I think it's really important that we dive into that phrase because what that essentially means is that US citizens and legal permanent residents can still cross regardless of their reasons for travel. So a US citizen who comes to Mexico to get a haircut is still considered essential travel under this border closure, whereas an asylum seeker who's fleeing for their life is not considered essential travel. So it really calls into the question this idea of non-essential. This border closure order was made under the guise of protecting public health, even though actually the United States had much more widespread cases of COVID-19 than Mexico had at the time, and still does have more cases. But it was made under this guise of public health, but really I would say introduced on the basis of this long trajectory of trying to limit access to asylum. And it's affected asylum seekers in two primary ways. So the first way is that it ceased processing of asylum seekers at designated ports of entry. So those people who by the end of February had been waiting for 4 months are now facing an indefinite wait. The picture that you see on the left is a couple of those individuals. We're not showing their face for reasons of security, but the man who's on the left, the family in whole, there's also 3 kids. They had fled from the state of Mexico after the father, who's on the left, was shot by organized crime. So he actually still has 2 bullets lodged in him from the attack, and his family tried to report it to the police. The cartel just came back and threatened them more, and so they saw that their only option would be to flee to Nogales, Mexico, and they continue to be in fear because the organized crime has searched their house in the place that they fled from, not to steal anything, but to find out where is it that they've gone. So they already, by March 20th, had been waiting for 4 months in Nogales, and now have been waiting 6 months and are facing an even longer wait because these border closures, although theoretically 30 days, have continued to be renewed. And some of the families are really struggling with whether or not they should go back south because of the limbo of Nogales, Mexico. Because of the border closure, there's also fewer jobs or less economic support. But this family has told me there's just no way that we could go back. If we go back, we're going to be killed. So we have to stay here in Nogales and just hope for the best and hope that our border will be reopened. So that's one effect of the border closure. The other effect on asylum seekers is that any migrant from Mexico, Guatemala, or El Salvador who enters between ports of entry is being immediately returned, the term that they're using is expelled, back to Mexico without any consideration of their need for protection or asylum. So that means that a couple of weeks ago, there was a pregnant woman from Honduras who had fled with her 2 kids and actually had been sexually assaulted in Mexico that was then trying to cross the border in Arizona to seek safety in the United States. She was 8 months pregnant when she was detained by Border Patrol agents. And when she expressed that she was feeling pain, maybe she was having contractions, the Border Patrol agents, what they did is loaded her up in a car and drove her south to the US-Mexico border to Sasabe, Arizona, and told her that she had to go back to Mexico, despite the fact that she was pleading that she was afraid of being in Mexico, she's afraid of being in Honduras. They forced her to cross back south, and Mexico has given her no legal status. So she's in complete limbo in Mexico with really deep confusion about how is it that she can keep herself and her kids and her very soon to be born baby alive and safe in this time. So that's been the effect of those expulsions of people who enter between ports of entry, is women like this Honduran woman who are detained by Border Patrol and then immediately brought back to Mexico without any legal process. So again, I think the key point to reflect on is that this border closure has been done under the guise of closing to non-essential travel. But I would really encourage you to reflect on the fact that fleeing for your life, that this Honduran woman and this Mexican family are undergoing essential journeys. And I'd love to dialogue more about that, but I think I'm going to pass it to our other panelists.
Thank you for sharing that, Joanna, and for summarizing a very difficult thing to talk about. So now we will welcome Joyce, and we'll just give her a second. We'll share her screen and then she can begin.
Okay. Hope I'm doing this correctly. Hi there. I'm not sure I'm showing up on the screen. Am I doing this right?
Yes, we can see you and we can see your presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah.
Angry Tias and Abuelas is a group that grassroots organization, all volunteer. We have no staff, no one is paid anything. That started June of 2018. The photograph you see is our first trip to the Reynosa Bridge. This was south of McAllen, and the Reynosa Hidalgo Bridge. And it was a group of people from Harlingen who drove 50 miles to McAllen when we had heard that there were people sleeping on the bridge, families, children, a real variety of people, for as much as 5 days. And so we took food and supplies to see what we could do to help, and to just figure out what was happening. So it was an eye-opening experience of finding 40 people who had been sleeping on the bridge for 5 days. About 2 weeks later, we formed the Angry Tias and Abuelas, and you can see the 7 of the 8 here. We have a new member since then who actually moved down here from Minnesota to join us and help us with communications. So this is just missing one of our members. We were active immediately in protesting family separation. This was happening at that time, and we became very aware of the impact on the people that we were helping. And we did stage a protest in front of the Brownsville federal courthouse, and actually had media arrive, and we helped to bring it to the attention of our community, and continued to do that, have continued to bring media attention. There have been a number of demonstrations, protests, gatherings to stand up for asylum seekers. This also was in the summer of 2018. So what you're seeing here at the beginning are our origins. Very quickly, we began taking backpacks, filling backpacks and duffel bags and all types of supplies to the bridges, but also to the bus stations, because we found people very early on. By the end of June, we were seeing families brought into the bus station, starting their journey north. And we started the bus station ministry, if you will, at that time. And this is us folding blankets in the McAllen bus station. And of course, both the Brownsville and the McAllen bus stations were filling up with people, but more so McAllen, which at one point had as many as 900 people a day being dropped off and coming over from the Catholic Charities shelter. So our bus station efforts, as well as our bridge efforts, continued simultaneously. And of course, now it's all bridge on the other side of the bridge. This is just one of our volunteer trips across the bridge into Matamoros. And the many volunteers, I do want to bring up that there have been so many volunteers in the valley. That's what we call our area, the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. So many volunteers, including sewing groups, quilting groups, all kinds of people who have made things and given them to us. Church World Service became involved early on in April of 2019. They began sending large shipments, thousands of blankets, and we had many partners by then, including local churches. This is a photograph from Matamoros, really only about 5 or 6 months ago, in the area where there were up to 850 tents within a short period of time. At this time, we were seeing a few tents and a few families because most of them were camped on the plaza. And this family from Honduras had fashioned their own stove from mud and tree limbs, and we're just extremely resourceful. And that family fortunately did eventually cross. We're not seeing a whole lot of that anymore, of course. So one of our biggest problems was trying to get sanitation for the people. This is in the plaza. You can't see the tents here, but you can see the minimal porta potties at a time when we were up to 600 people in the plaza, with a few up in the Levee Park on just the other side of that fence. That was a long, protracted battle, if you will, with the local officials. And eventually we had teams like this. You can see two of our tias on the far left, Susan and Lizzie, participating in meetings with Sister Norma Pimentel and the Mexican officials to try to come to terms with what kinds of support would be needed in that camp for the growing numbers of people. Just a shot of one of the many, many children. At one point, I think the estimation was as many as 700 children, because the camp head count was up to 2,500 by then. Many church groups were coming in, and a big part of what we found ourselves doing, along with providing direct services and supplies, was guiding people through and showing them the camp and introducing them to people. And we began a supply run within Mexico after many problems getting things across through Mexican customs. We discovered there's a Walmart in Matamoros and a Sam's Club. And so you can see the beginning of those big shopping trips, many of them. And those continue, but they are being done with sources within Matamoros now. This is one of the tents, the tiendas, we call them, the tent stores, where the asylum seekers are given the supplies, and then they distribute them from the tent stores. There are now 4. That's 2 of our teams they're helping. We've had at least a couple of trips to Washington, D.C. In this particular photograph, you can see when we met with another group from the border, that where we worked together to go to various representatives and senators' offices to present our concerns and to tell them our firsthand stories of what we were seeing and learning from the asylum seekers in the camps, and also in Reynosa and in the bus stations. But the bus stations had almost ended by then. And this is another one of our tours, taking people from a call to action group, a Catholic organization that had a conference here and wanted to see the border. Again, more demonstrations at the entrance of the Gateway Bridge in Brownsville. Josh Rubin, who you may be familiar with, started the Tornillo campaign, arrived in January in front of the bridge entrance and began demonstrations, daily demonstrations against MPP. And the primary focus of those demonstrations was to end MPP. And these were light demonstrations at night to draw attention to the issues of MPP and the Remain in Mexico program. In the last couple of weeks, there have been many new developments, some of these supposedly due to COVID-19. This is the new field hospital built by GRM, which is Global Response Management. That is the team of medical volunteers who arrived in September, and by now have actually brought in a mobile medical unit, but this is their most recent development. And that is a COVID camp, a COVID hospital to treat people. You can see people starting to wear masks, working very hard to get them to do that. It just does not really fit well in the culture of really Mexico and Central America, to stand back and have distance from people. There's a lot of hugging that has been part of the culture there with all of us for a long time. So Corona Check is one of the COVID testing options that was just brought in about a week ago by the medical team after many struggles to get them approved to come in. So they are now able to actually test people in the camp. This is a very new development to determine whether there are any existing cases of COVID-19 in the camp at this point. We started a sewing project about a month ago in order to give the women in the camp the opportunity to sew. And this is in offices outside of the camp, just on the other side of the fence. There's nowhere within that encampment to plug in machines and have tabletops really, or a place to work. And so this is being done at 2 office sites on the other side of the fence. So now they can actually make their own masks, and initially for the children, but also for the adults. So little by little, thousands of masks are coming in, as well as those that are being made by the women in the sewing project. So just a few photos here and there out of thousands, of course, that have occurred over the last couple of years. So many changes. COVID-19 seems to have been a very convenient way for the Trump administration to justify closing the border, with people in that camp who've been there as long as 9 months. There's one family, very familiar family, that we've been working with for a very long time there in the camp. And they're from Honduras. And in fact, the dad in that family, his father is a Mennonite minister in San Pedro La Sula, Honduras. So that family's been waiting 9 months. They were prepared for their 4th asylum court date in March 25th, which was after the dates were suddenly shifted to April, and then again to May, and now to June. So that family will have been there for over a year before having the opportunity, which we now worry is closed, to be able to get asylum, which they absolutely deserve. That family is in danger. That's why they haven't gotten on a bus and gone back. They can't. It's not possible for them to live if they go back to their community. So much of what Joanna said, and just really, it was a wonderful presentation there to lay out all of these progressions in terms of our policies in this country and the impact on people. We've seen many of those same kinds of egregious cases against families, including a woman who was 8 months pregnant here, who was taken to a hospital in Brownsville by the Border Patrol agents and given injections to stop her labor, and then sent back over into the Matamoros encampment. Fortunately, there's a medical shelter that was able to take her in, and she did deliver her baby successfully. But that was just one of those situations I've seen that have just really been appalling and shocking, and have strained my sense of respect for our nation right now. I just am a patriot who is really questioning the policies of this administration, and questioning how we can continue to support what is happening. So I think one of my biggest final statements would be everyone needs to vote in November, and everyone needs to push very hard to make sure that there is access to voting. And I believe that we have a majority of people in this country who do not support the policies that we're seeing on the border right now.
Thank you so much, Joyce, for sharing with us what can be difficult things to speak about and difficult things to see. But thank you for your work. And we'll now move on to Jack and Linda Knox, who are coming from Douglas, Arizona. Yeah, welcome.
Okay, let us get ourselves here.
Okay.
So I'm Linda Knox, and my husband Jack, we live in Douglas, which is a small town on the border. It's east of Nogales. In every border town, there are things that are the same and there are things that are different. So we want to tell you just a few things specific to what is going on in Douglas and Agua Prieta, which is the name of the town in Sonora that is right across the border wall from us. First of all, CAME, which is Centro de Atención al Migrante Éxodos, is the migrant shelter. And it was originally established for returning migrants who were coming back, sent back from the US. But for the last 2 years, it has been mainly asylum seekers. So when I talk about CAME, that is the migrant shelter in Agua Prieta. It's also the place where, after some several false starts, the list of people who are presenting themselves for asylum is controlled by the director of CAME. It had been controlled by government officials, but because of threats from cartels, that didn't work. And so now the director at CAME controls the list. Originally, people were coming to Agua Prieta, staying, waiting to get into the shelter. But at this point, there are not a lot of people in Agua Prieta waiting, because they're able to get on the list by using the internet from their homes if they don't have to flee right away. And so they wait and have not been called to even come to Agua Prieta until their name was close to being up. The next place that we want to, too far, back the other way. So this is a new building, and it's called the Centro de Recursos para Migrantes, which is the CRM. This is a new building. It's only 2 years old, but the organization this entity has been here for quite a while, and it was also originally for returning migrants from the US. At this point, people who are waiting for asylum are able to come to this center 3 times a day for eating, for taking showers, for having something to drink, for the kids playing out in the yard for a while. And the third place is the tent, or the carpa, which is what has been built right by the port of entry. So on the left, you see that's Jack back in the yellow vest, and migrants who were waiting at that point were putting up the structure of the tent, which went in last June. And you can see from the picture on the right, it is right at the pedestrian gate to the port of entry. And please note the sign above the tree that says "Welcome to the United States." This is what happened in Agua Prieta. Migrants come to the migrant shelter, wait and live at CAME until their number comes up, and then they are escorted to this tent where they actually spend the night and stay there with their families, except for coming back to the CRM a few times a day until their name is called. So this was all part of the metering system, what the adaptation was there. What Jack and I have mainly done is we helped accompany people from the Migrant Resource Center to the tent, and also from CAME to the Migrant Resource Center and then to the tent. Because of threats by organized crime to migrants and to volunteers and workers at the Migrant Resource Center and at CAME, it was necessary to have a presence of people walking with the migrants to say, to help mitigate the threat of cartels. And we did a lot of that work for a year. We also helped with people who came, other volunteers who came. There were Mexican volunteers, there were volunteers from the US, There were specifically volunteers from Christian peacemaker teams and from Presbyterian Peace Fellowship who had been trained and to do accompaniment in dangerous places, other places in the world. And we helped to orient them to the realities of what was going on in Agua Prieta and the logistics of what we did. The border actually closed here on like everywhere on the 20th. It was actually that day Jack had gone over. We knew that the last people who had been accepted for asylum was on the 18th. And so on the Saturday, Jack went over and asked some people at the port of entry, when are you going to accept people again? And the first thing we got was this roundabout, oh, we don't know, maybe next week. But then later on, we heard the official word that the port was closed. At this time now, there are 33 people still living at Kame. There are a few people who are rotating in and out of the tent, mainly to keep it from being overtaken either by organized crime or by homeless people to just guard this place. The people who have chosen to remain at Kame are living there and really not going out. So they are really being protected both from the virus and from organized crime. The volunteers who are coming now are all Mexican volunteers, except there is one guy who works with MCC Mexico, who is a US citizen who is down there for a while. Yeah, but he's living in AP. But those are the people now who are supporting the migrants as far as food and any health care that might need to be given. We have not crossed into Agua Prieta since March. The other part of our reality now is we are seeing just right on the other side of into the US is, I forgot this picture. This is some people, this is Christian Peacemaker team's people accompanying people to the tent. There are lots of families and lots of stories about all these kids. So yeah, we are also seeing now the Border Patrol, a station where people who are now apprehended crossing the fence are being returned right away. We hear they're only staying in the US less than 2 hours. At this point, the Migrant Resource Center is not really doing much with these folks. They are giving them some information, but not much is happening with them at this point. And finally, our other thing, one more. And our other reality is the building of this wall. This is happening to the east of us, not very far. And it's not a 20-foot wall like we have right here in town. It is a 30-foot wall. You can see by the comparison of the people with the wall. And over on the left is the construction. It's really that they're really tearing up the country there. So this is the other part of our reality that's going on now. Yeah.
I guess the only thing I would add is that, as Linda indicated, we haven't crossed in quite a while. Things here are really shut down, both in Douglas and across the border in Agua Prieta. We made a conscious decision to rely on the Mexican volunteers so that people wouldn't be going back and forth across, risking carrying the coronavirus in either direction. And it's hard. We don't have much contact other than by Zoom and WhatsApp and things like that with people on the other side right now. But the people at the shelter are also just staying in. They are allowed to go across the street if they need medicine, but if they need to go to a doctor, they're escorted, but they're not going in and out. If they were to choose to leave, that would be a permanent choice. They're trying to protect them from both organized crime and from the virus. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, Catherine.
Thank you, Jack and Linda. Perfect. So now all of the presenters can come back onto the screen. And before, I'll start with some questions, but just to all of the viewers who are watching, you can use the Q&A, so you can ask questions through there, and then I will be able to read them, or the panelists will read them, and then we'll be able to answer some of your questions. So go ahead and write down some questions if you have any. But I will begin just with the question of, maybe if you could touch on how life in Mexico has changed due to COVID-19, or if there have been, you know, here in the US, it's kind of state by state. And so maybe starting with you, Joanna, if you could kind of give an example of, are there curfews? If there are, where are migrants going and how are they affected by new laws set in place due to COVID-19?
That's a great question, Kat. And you're right that it does vary somewhat on a state-by-state basis. So I can only speak to the state of Sonora, which is where we're in Mexico. Here, a couple of weeks ago, well, there had been a series of increasing restrictions related to social distancing. And then a couple of weeks ago, any kind of non-essential activity was shut down. So there's only 6 reasons that you're allowed to be out of your house. Going to find food, medicine, going to the bank, and I can't remember the other 3 because they wouldn't be things that I'd do anyways. But there are checkpoints on the roads throughout the city of people who are getting stopped if they have more than 2 people in their vehicle or are getting questioned about what's their reason for travel. And we have seen a very heavy presence of National Guard and municipal police. The National Guard stopped by while we were serving breakfast just yesterday to make sure that we were socially distancing. So we're feeling I mean, it's important to have public health measures, but we're also feeling the impact of that militarization on migrants specifically, especially the role of the National Guard, which has no real legal authority related to public health. Migrants have reported, so one of the challenges is that the main shelter in Nogales, people can be there overnight, but usually they don't let folks stay during the day. So it's the Juan Bosco shelter. At this point, Juan Bosco is letting women and children stay during the day, but men still have to be out of the shelter during the day. So the men report being harassed a lot on the streets because they kind of have to kill time all day long when they're not supposed to be outside. So there's one particular area of a basketball court that they're theoretically allowed to be in during the day in between after they've gotten meals at our aid center. But several of the men have said that they've been stopped by the police and questioned for why they're out and have to show some kind of paperwork and also explain their migration situation. So it's definitely having, I mean, there's enforcement in general in the state of Sonora, but some of that's having a disproportionate impact on migrants because they don't have a home to stay in place in.
Thank you. I don't know if Jack and Linda, if you have anything to touch, maybe it looks a little different in Douglas, Agua Prieta, or maybe just even new vulnerabilities that migrants are seeing due to this expanded closure of the border.
Well, at the shelter, people, it's a little different from the Juan Bosco shelter in Nogales because our people stay at the shelter all the time. They don't have to go out and leave. And we're fortunate that we don't have a lot of migrants out in the streets because of the system that evolved of them being able to get on the list and stay in their home villages. There are other migrants there. They are all under the control of the organized crime people. We have no way of knowing their numbers. But we do know there are migrants out, but we don't end up having contact with them because they are put in safe houses that are owned by the organized crime people and are not given any freedom at all there. Other than that, it's pretty similar to what Joanna described in Nogales. There's curfews, there's limits to, I think Agua Prieta has one person per car, but it's very similar to that. What were you going to say?
I was gonna say.
Okay. Yeah.
And Joyce, I don't know if it looks a little different with the more tent cities, structures that are all the time outside. If you want to unmute yourself and then.
Okay, yes, very, very different. With a tent camp of up to 2,000 people, it may be that it's down a few hundred by now because of people who've left in buses over the past month from time to time. But this is literally a tent encampment. And there really are no shelters in the city of Matamoros. That has always been an issue. And so this encampment is the shelter, if you will. So in the past week or so, as I mentioned, there has been fencing set up to encompass the entire camp, which is quite large in space. It is a municipal park, a nature park, if you will, and it sits right against the Rio Grande. And so the fencing now goes all the way around it and has razor wire at the top. And there's one guarded entrance now into the camp. And this is totally new after a year and a half or more of people just moving back and forth as however they wish. The pro side of that is that there had been gangs entering the camp, and cartel-related gangs created problems, as you can certainly imagine. And there was a lot of fear of COVID being brought into the camp that way. So maybe the positive side of it is keeping all of those things out. The other side of it is the fear of a concentration camp type of a setup developing. But there, to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any curfew systems established in the city of Matamoros, which is a city of many. I believe it's about 1 million people. So this is a very large city sitting right on the border of Brownsville. And we understand that there have been a few cases of COVID confirmed in the city. Initially, they were people who were traveling, upper class people traveling to Europe and coming back with the COVID-19 virus. And now we don't know what's happening in the city other than the fact that because of some closings of businesses and other issues around the COVID regulations, that some of the people who had left the camp under MPP still to get apartments and to try to find little part-time jobs, those people have lost their jobs and they now have no food and they have no way to return to the camp. And so we're dealing with that issue right now. People who are, you know, on the edge of potential starvation because of no food and no ability to pay for rent and so forth. So it's a very different scenario. It's a very large city with a large tent encampment in this big park. And the city itself has kind of been in denial for a very long time until recently. So that's where a lot of our concern has been, that those people coming in and out of the camp were a potential danger. We are not going in and haven't been for at least 6 weeks, almost 2 months for some of us, because of fears on both sides. The fear of taking COVID-19 into a very vulnerable, isolated little camp. And on the other hand, many of us are older and being in that profile of people who are vulnerable. So we are working through virtual communication. We are in touch every day. Several of the TIAs have very close relationships with the families in the camp and stay in daily contact to find out what they need. And we have, of course, as I mentioned in the slides, arranged for supplies on very large scale distribution of supplies and food within the city to the camp.
Thank you. And so one of the questions here is kind of asking about people who had appointments through the MPP program and are now being turned back again. And so I'm wondering kind of two questions of, are people still coming and being put on these original lists of the metered list to enter? And then now what is happening to people who have been returned to Mexico but have a court date in the US, and how that's changed now, even more so with COVID-19. And I guess we can just start in the same order if you want to go
Maybe
first,
everybody.
Joanna.
Well, I can say that some of that I'm not sure about. I really am not quite sure about, but I do know that there are people being returned without any kind of CFI interview or anything. And the camp is not taking more people in. So I'm not sure what is available to help them in
Okay.
Matamoros.
Thank you.
So speaking in the context of Nogales, kind of three dynamics that are happening. It's a two-part question, but there's actually three different groups. So there have been fewer people arriving who are then waiting to present at the port, but there continue to be people who arrive. So it's maybe not as many as before, but certainly we just had a family a couple weeks ago whose house was shot up in Guanajuato and they fled to the border. So those arrivals do continue. Those who have been in the MPP process, so they've been waiting for their court date in the US, when they're here in Nogales, and this is also applies to folks who cross near Agua Prieta, their court date isn't close. Their court date is all the way over in El Paso, which is a 10-hour drive. So not only have those court dates been postponed, I was talking to somebody yesterday who had a court date in May that now is in late July, but he also has to, the US government is saying that he has to go all the way to Juarez, which is a 10-hour bus ride, just to get the piece of paper that says that his court date was changed. Even though I can look up online and print out the new court date, the US government is saying if somebody doesn't go to Juarez and present and get that piece of paper, then they won't be accepted in July. So that's caused a lot of anxiety and challenges for people in Nogales because it's not safe to get on a crowded bus and go to Juarez and expose themselves. There's more cases also in Juarez than there are in Nogales. But people don't feel like they have another option because they don't want to give up their cases altogether. So we're gonna, if there's one solvable issue that we come out of this webinar, I think that we actually could get the US government to change their posture on this. If everybody who's listening right here contacts their representatives, asks them to ask DOJ and DHS why they're making people go travel long distances to get court notices. So that's just my action alert plug because it feels like a very solvable bureaucratic problem. The one other piece though I'd add about MPP is we have a few new people who are getting placed in MPP. I mentioned that it's Mexicans, Salvadorans, Hondurans, and Guatemalans that are being subject to these rapid returns or expulsions. We have still had some Nicaraguans and Ecuadorians who have been newly placed in MPP with court dates later on in the summer. That number is lower because we've excluded a bunch of nationalities, but that continues to be the case here.
The people we've had who were sent back with MPP have all gone to, as Joanna said, they're waiting probably in Nogales for a court date in El Paso.
Thank you. So we have another question. Most of this, I think, has been kind of related to adults, or maybe we're assuming that we're speaking about adults. And there's a question here asking if any of you have knowledge on where unaccompanied children are living right now, or after they've been denied entry to the US kind of through this expulsion program sent back to Mexico. Does anyone have an idea of that?
So just a couple pieces that we know on unaccompanied children. Mexican unaccompanied children who are being expelled generally are turned over to the DIF, which is the Mexican government. It's kind of the Mexican equivalent of Child Protective Services. The US government, however, is considering fewer children unaccompanied legally. So legally, an unaccompanied minor would be somebody who's traveling without their parents. But the US is now considering anybody who's traveling with any kind of family member accompanied rather than unaccompanied. So we have had families that have been returned where it's the uncle and the nephew or some other family composition where the kids should have been designated as unaccompanied. It's been a lot harder to figure out what's happening. So anyway, so we know that there's a lot of those unaccompanied minors who are Mexicans who are being turned over to DEEF through these rapid expulsions. It's been harder to find out with the Central American minors. We have heard reports that there were many minors who were returned near Sasabe and then were detained by Mexican immigration and then were deported back to Central America. One of the challenges with finding things out is that it used to be that Nogales was the main port of deportation. And Jack and Linda spoke to this a little bit with the changing dynamic in Agua Prieta. But now with these expulsions, they're sending them back across any port. So they're not necessarily, we don't necessarily have contact with them. But we do know that there have been unaccompanied minors we have heard reports of Central American unaccompanied minors who have been expelled back to Mexico and then deported by Mexican authorities or voluntarily returned by Mexican authorities to Central America.
Thank you. Do either Jack and Linda or Joyce have something to add to that, or I can go on to another question? Okay. So we are coming close to an hour, so we'll just have a few more questions. But I think it would be good to speak on maybe the lasting effects that this is going to have on immigration and on migrants themselves. So those are kind of two different things, but we have this policy enacted right now, and I think once it's lifted, there will still be long-lasting effects. So maybe in your eyes or in the eyes of those who you all work with, what are those lasting effects that you see?
I would like to just address one of those effects, which is the long-term effects of family separation, which was just horribly violent 2 years ago and continues through other avenues now. I think we've already seen the damage done through pulling families apart, and so that's something that I think will be a burden for us to bear for quite a long time, because those are long-term effects on children and certainly on the families themselves. So that, and just the impact on how refugees used to see our country as a place they could go for asylum, a place they could be safe, a country of laws, as opposed to the ones they came from. And so now I think there's a considerable amount of discouragement about what the United States stands for. So that's an impact that I'm very concerned about.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jack and Lynn? Oh.
Okay, I wasn't sure who was coming on. I definitely see things going on longer term. I see people also questioning where they're going to be safe, and not only because they're questioning what our government's plans are or aren't, but also, for example, shortly before the border was closed, we had an individual, and he and his family were assuming that when they entered the asylum process, they would be ultimately sent to their sponsor in California, which was the way things were happening. He was very afraid because he knew that when he arrived in California, there were representatives from organized crime who were going to expect him to pay $8,000, and he didn't have the $8,000. And so that was going to put him under their thumb in the United States, as well as under their thumb the way he had been for quite a while in Mexico. So there was a growing threat from organized crime. And we've only seen that from a few people, but that's something that we're worried about that would continue.
Yeah.
But we also are not sure where all of this is going with regard to any changes that are going to follow whatever happens once the coronavirus thing has run its course. And of course, they're using it politically to try to keep people out. But there's other changes that may occur not only politically, but culturally in our society as well that may have an impact. So I think everything's really up in the air right now. I think one thing we can do is to use this time when things are just sort of in this in-between time to really think through some of the issues in our culture that we need to address that we haven't been addressing, to maybe help move things in a new direction once things start opening back up in a realistic sense.
Actually, I want to start where Jack left off, because I think it's really important that I almost think your question is optimistic, kind of. What's going to happen when all of these policies put in place with coronavirus are lifted? I think that honestly, that my biggest fear is that we've established a new normal and a new starting place, and it's what we've seen over the course of many years is that policies then become entrenched. Family separation, I think, was the exception to that. that a lot of advocacy was able to scale back that particular practice over that summer. Although, as Joyce said, it happens in other dimensions. These other policies have been cumulative, and every time have been setting a new normal of how we treat people who are fleeing violence. So I'm afraid that this is our new starting point. And that it's going to be hard to go back politically from here. And that's why I think Jack's encouragement is so important. As far as the impact on migrants, just to build on a couple of observations that Jack and Joyce both brought up, we certainly see people that are going to be trapped in a deeper cycle of debt because of the economic impact of this time, what Joyce mentioned about folks losing jobs, family members in the US losing jobs. A lot of people are borrowing much larger sums of money just to survive. And that's a debt that's a burden of debt that they're going to carry forward for many, many years to come. And then just the health effects of prolonged limbo and prolonged trauma. There's a lot of research about how that ultimately breaks down individuals or humans or makes them less able to realize their potential. And so the longer that we're subjecting people to this limbo, the more trauma these kids are carrying, the more trauma the parents are carrying, and the harder it's going to be for them to continue to draw on their resilience, which they have a lot of, but draw on their resilience to overcome that trauma.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I think the last question I want to end with, there are many people watching right now, and I'm sure this has been helpful for them, but at times when you learn more information, you feel maybe a little stuck. So how are ways in which people who are watching this and many others, how they can be involved with your work, but also what are tangible ways that they can participate from where they're living that you think, and Joanna, you touched on this, and Joyce as well with just voting in general, but what are tangible ways that people can participate to either support you in the work that you're doing where you are, or support you on maybe a larger scale? And do you want to start, Joyce?
Yeah, I will. I do want to just say that 4-letter word vote, but because I think that is really critical to stand up and make something happen. Speak out, contact your representatives. If you haven't already started that, start that conversation. We actually do have on one very practical level. One of the things that we are doing through one of our TIAs is a kind of a pen pal program for the migrants in the local detention center in Port Isabel. And she started that a few months ago, and it's been going pretty well. And some of those folks have been in there for 9 months to 2 years, really long periods of time, and they've never committed a crime. So you've got some very discouraged people who really would benefit from having somebody to write them encouraging cards and notes. And you can reach us, through either me directly or go to our Facebook page and connect with us, and we can get you started on that.
three ways I think that you can take action. One, I already mentioned, if you all join this campaign to get the US government to stop making people show up to get a piece of paper. So again, there's just contact your representatives or senators and ask them to inquire with the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security as to why they're still requiring folks to show up at the port. So that's the advocacy side. The education side is also really critical. If we're starting, if my theory is right that this is adjusting us to a new normal, then I think we need to be all the more persistent and thorough in sharing folks' stories and experiences in the community. And you can look at the Keno Border Initiative website. We have in the Learn section, we have a migrant migrant stories page where you can read some of the stories of folks who've come through Nogales, and please share those with your friends and family members and others in the community. You can also follow us on social media and share those resources and stories. We're posting at least weekly. We have another story from someone in Nogales. And then the third is that I think that direct assistance continues to be important. As we've had fewer volunteers and fewer in-kind donations, we are spending a lot more on humanitarian aid, in addition to keeping alive our education and advocacy work. And I know that that's true of other organizations along the border and within the United States. So I actually think this day was invented as Giving Tuesday, which I wasn't aware of until recently, but this might be an opportunity to take direct action in that way as well.
Well, in addition to some of the things that were already mentioned, we obviously, well, to reiterate first, we obviously need some better laws, and we need to have better leaders, and so we need to vote. But I think when I look at the people we see coming up and gain more understanding of what they've lived with and have tried to get away from, we could impact some of that by making some changes in how we deal with our economics. We accept so much that of the things we buy that are bought, that are manufactured on the backs of people who are paid less than a living wage. Yeah. And I think culturally we need to make some real shifts. We need to stop buying the products that the cartel people sell. We can cut into their bottom line, and that would change. By weakening them, we would definitely change the situation along the border, so we can, in our culture, hopefully stop using their products, their drugs, or their prostitutes, or any of the other things that they're selling. And that's a big shift. That's not something that we can just sort of snap our fingers and do. But we need to raise our children in ways that they learn how to have more confidence in themselves, more hope for the future, and more capacity to have genuine relationships with people so that they don't have to do those things.
I think you're muted, Catherine. You are.
Thank you, Jack and Linda. I'm sure all of us watching right now would love to speak with you for longer and just sit down and really, just learn more ways in which we can help or support or call for change. But this is it's a good beginning. And so I would just like to thank all of our panelists for your excellent work and your information that you have provided. And we would like to thank all of the attendees who have joined this informational webinar. And you can contact all of these 3-4 panelists through those of us who work at MCC. So you can just reply to the email that you received to be a part of this, and you can get in contact with them. And so this webinar has also been recorded, and it will be available online tomorrow. You will receive an email with the link to the recording and a reminder to sign up for the upcoming webinars. And so our next webinar will be on Tuesday, May 19th at the same time as today, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 p.m. Mountain Standard, 11 a.m. Pacific Time. And again, we will talk with MCC staff and partners and friends from across the southern U.S. border who will be reporting from their fields and provide current information on what is specifically happening with asylum seekers. So we spoke a lot about asylum seekers today, but we'll dig in even more with more specifics for asylum seekers next week. And so, yeah, this webinar has been brought to you by MCC US Immigration Network. Please stay well and be safe. And especially if you are an essential worker watching this, we thank you for your care for the rest of us. So thank you from all of us, and have a good afternoon.